So don't worry, you're going to have time to enjoy it. And if any question, please write it down on the chat. And I hope you enjoy the session. Welcome, Ms. Doctora Mari Campanario.
Gracias, Laura. Welcome, everyone. Bienvenidos. Before we begin, before I even one more step in the direction of speaking to this evening, I really want to pause to honor and remember all the people who have passed in this last year, either due to social unrest or to the pandemic or to people that have just done things that are out of control and purposely destructive towards others who are different. So before we start, I would just like to pause for a moment to remember all those people. And the second thing I'd like to do is I would like to thank all of you. I'd like to thank you for coming this evening. I would like to thank you for staying in the field. As Laura indicated, I've been in education now for 44 years. And the best 44 years ever. It has been magic, and I love education, and I'm extremely passionate, which you'll probably notice as we go along. I am going to have some opportunities for you to join breakout rooms. I've been very fortunate to be a teacher, a principal, a district coordinator, interacted with the Department of Justice, teach at the university, do consulting, and present, of course, at conferences, and very honored to do some work with benchmark education. And again, honoring you, remembering your work and those that have paved the way for us. So welcome this evening. I hope we have a wonderful time here where we become very reflective and thoughtful. We're here for a very specific reason, and that is because we are all educators, right? So the title of this is Leadership and Language and Power and all of these things together. So when I say educators, I mean leaders. We are leaders. Our students, our families look to us to guide them and give them a path. We decide where, how, and when language has the potential to become powerful, to become either a powerful weapon in our classrooms and our schools or a tool for learning and advocacy. And that's what we're here to talk a little bit about tonight. Donaldo Macedo, who is a dear friend, talks a lot, and I'll just quickly pick a couple of these. Power has to be a little bit invisible to control, and language is not visible. It is a very, very, very easy way to control people, because if you think about the ramifications of language, think about how often we use the term oppressed in school. Not very often, but we say things like at risk, ay pobrecito, ay que no puede, hay que apoyarle, right? We always use these terms, these euphemisms to mean something subtle in there that really adds this layer of bias. And really, we in school enact discrimination by label. We label them as special education, English learner, African American. We create a box, and we don't sometimes hold ourselves as an educational community accountable for that reality that we create with that language. So tonight we're going to look a little bit at our lenses. I know for you it's afternoon, for me it's already 7 o'clock here in Massachusetts, but we're going to look at our lenses a little bit. And one of the things that we find, whoop, almost froze, is the importance of leadership and language, right? And power. Do we use language as a weapon, as a tool? Who's talking? Who listens? How do they look? Because our body language is part of our language, right? We have confident body language. We own the room, right? My 8th graders were at least a foot taller than me, and none of them moved when I told them not to move. Why? Because, that body language, until Fernando stopped next to me one day and said, Miss, usted es bien chaparita. And I was like, siéntate, don't talk to me right now, right? Go sit down. When they noticed that I was small. But if you look at the cartoons, my favorite is the one in the middle, right? I selected Spanish. Now see if you can figure out how to withdraw your allowance. How do you motivate kids to learn another language, regardless of what that might be, right? And how is it that we take care of our languages to protect our culture, because that is where our cultures live. So very much so, language becomes powerful. It becomes powerful in terms of culture. It becomes powerful in terms of control, in terms of constraining the contributions of people, right? Who do we read about? Who do we talk about? Who do we choose to put inside of books and magazines and TV shows? All of that is control and language, because language is also visual. Power can be physical, that's true, but the most powerful people in history have not been physical fighters. They have been people that can manipulate language. And it is not power that represents the potential communication problem. It's the misuse of power. So when we find that language isn't working to communicate what we need it to do, particularly in the educational field, it's probably because there's something happening with the language that we're being given to use or that we're choosing to use. And we can't talk about this without nodding our heads to this lens of systemic oppression, right? There's individual oppression, and then there's systemic institutional oppression. We could have, a conversation for months around what this has generated across the world, specifically in this country and in our classrooms. But we know that somehow there's a communication going on to Black and brown and immigrant and linguistically different children that sometimes says to them and their families, you are less than, unless you choose to become as we say you will become, particularly linguistically. So there is truly a linguistic prejudice that exists. And I just want you to think for a moment how in the movies, years and years ago, they idealized a French accent. It was like very romantic, but not so much so a Russian accent, not so much so Chinese intonation. So there is linguistic prejudice. And that, for a very long time, has created linguistic discrimination. And it's so widely accepted, this linguistic discrimination. Oh, that's not how you say it. Or, well, they must not have gone to school. Listen to how they speak, or listen to, how they try to communicate something with half the words missing or in another language. It is a back door to discrimination. And in fact, there's a gentleman, Dr. Wayne O'Neill, who describes it as linguicism. And he wrote in 1997 that this linguistic prejudice is the last legitimate prejudice that people really don't see, and that really is veiled racism when we think about it. There are some historical implications around language, leadership, and power that impact the equity in our schools today, not just for our students, not just for us as educators, but for us as leaders. So as we spend this short time together today, please keep in mind, I see you all as leaders. You are leaders in this work of lifting up communities, lifting up children and their families. And for us it is very important, especially at a conference like CABE, to think about the historical implications of language, leadership, and power. I can tell you all, when I went to first grade, I was a student who was learning English at 6, right? My house, nobody spoke a lot of English. We got a TV, and I guess Ed Sullivan must have helped me, or Miss Jean in Romper Room or something. So I had bits and pieces, and my cousins who were older had gone first. But I can remember being put in the corner. I can remember when I was in middle school getting called to the office so the assistant principal could scream and yell at me, and I would turn to the newly arrived immigrant students and translate what he was screaming at me in English so that they would know why they were in trouble. And most of the time, I can tell you, it was this implication of language and power, and oh, you must be talking about something irrelevant if you're not speaking in English. So I chose the term leadership very purposely, because as I look and I see there are 152 people participating this evening, every one of you is a leader. Every one of you is a leader. Every one of you is a voice and an advocate for the communities we serve. So I'm going to use leadership and leader and educator interchangeably. I do not believe they are different. I do not, because we start everything from where we are as educators. So think of it this way. Leadership is a verb. It is what we do. It is an action. It is not a position. It's not a role we have for a minute. Okay? It is an action that we do every day in our classrooms, in our schools, in our districts, in our lives. And it's defined by what we do, not the role we're in, titulo, whatever it is, doctor, doctora, principal, superintendent, professor. No, it is defined by what we do, that we are leaders. And so I would like for you to do this activity sort of internally, and I've got a little timer here. I'm just going to give you about 30 seconds to look at these questions silently and think about it. Think about where you sit professionally. There's a meeting at school, you go to CABE. Where do you sit? How did you get to that role you are in? When you sit at that table, do you have a voice? How does the language use of that group at the table help or hinder other people who may want to sit with you? Can they sit with you? And what could be done to increase access at the table that you sit professionally? I ask you to think about that, because that is the power of leadership and language in providing equity and access. It's not just thinking about what we bring to use for materials and do we raise our hand, do we say, we have to help them. It is monitoring our own behaviors professionally, right? So there are some practices we might look for in our classrooms to see what we're doing, how we're doing it, what we're saying, right? And I will go back and look at some of the questions and things that people are posting. And thank you so much for being actively engaged with each other. But literacy practices are often where we look to see, oh, is this where there's powerful language? I want you to open that to literacy practices being everything about literacy. Reading, writing, speaking, listening, culture, body language, predictability, inference, right? Across all content areas. So if we know our students well and we establish strong relationships, that's one way to begin to empower. If we have high expectations, right? Grade level, help them reach their potential. If we use the right scaffolds, right? If we really validate, this is important, the literacy practices and funds of knowledges from home and communities. I came from a home where there was zero printed material, where my mom can still, at 87, not write her name, her real name, not the name the immigration guy gave her because she didn't know how to speak English and she didn't know how to spell her name and she didn't know how to write her name. So he made one up, right? But story, my mother can do everything with story. And we all learned so much from her and from my father. So we really need to think about what those funds of knowledge mean to create a power base in that classroom that starts from that fund of knowledge that the children bring. Often we don't recognize that fund of knowledge. We only recognize academic language and we say that's where the power is. That's true. There is some degree of power there in academic language. It's formal. It's abstract. It's very technical. And it gives you a different set of assumptions and skills. And it's a requirement, right? To be successful, you have to be good at academic language. But we're here in this room, 163 of us virtually, because as educators, we have to decide when language has the potential to be weaponized, when it's a tool for learning, when it gives us vision, when it embraces diversity for all. And is it for all students? Is it for each one that I see as an individual, or is it for every student because I give them the same? These little words that we use convey power and convey how many people we want to speak to, how many students we want to reach. So there's this term that's been used often, standard English learners, right? English learners, special needs, struggling students, and power usually goes teacher to teacher, principal to teacher, teacher to student. And always we ask ourselves when we're involved in this language exchange, do they trust us? Is what they're saying credible? But language goes through every permutation and there's power in all of it. And I had said this before, speaking, reading, listening, writing, body language, even the physical space conveys power, right? This room that I'm in conveys a certain kind of power, right? But we're not alone as educators, and we're not alone as people who have this power bestowed on us because of language. Think about a doctor. Think about when you see the doctor in his office. If we see the doctor in the office, his language and his power is pretty important. But if we were to see them at a party, at a grocery store, all of a sudden some of his power is gone. So the power of language is also granted by your physical space. We really talk a lot. And of course at CABE, I just listened to Jim Cummings. I'll be going to several presentations. How do we teach this thing, this standard English to, speakers of non-standard English or of other languages? Flores and Rosa talk a lot about this ratiolinguistic way that we stigmatize language so that even students who speak perfectly fluent English, which I did by the time I was in 7th grade, I'm sure many of you did and do. But whoever's listening to us, if they hear an accent, if we use our hands too much, all of a sudden, they think that we are non-standard English speakers and they make an assessment and they assume how much power we have and how much power they have. Just because of accent, choices of vocabulary, sentence structure, ethnicity, and race. That is how powerful this thing that we call language is. I'm going to ask you to look again fairly quickly because, you know, this evening we don't have a lot of time, but you can see on the left, civil rights laws. I just lifted it right out of a federal web page. And I underlined some words: enforcement, improved, opportunities of millions, many barriers removed, it's possible, and they can participate effectively, but they're not proficient in regular education. I want you to think about the language there. It does not say that it's just going to happen. It has to be enforced, which means someone does not want to do it, right? You're going to improve, but that doesn't mean that you're going to make it the best. If I have 0 and I lift to 1, I improved. That doesn't mean I got to 100. It doesn't say opportunities for every student. It says millions. Many barriers, not all of them, right, have been removed. It's possible. It's not a guarantee. It's possible. And I've already created a limitation for you in the language I choose to identify you because you are not proficient. And it doesn't say you will participate to the max and get the best that you can. It says effectively, good enough. Not the best, but good enough. In regular education, which means if you're not in that system in that way, you're not getting whatever regular is. So think about that very carefully, particularly as we see people wanting to change policy around what we do around language or what we do around instruction for our children. Culture and poverty. This is a quote out of a very famous, and the citation is tiny, but if you would like it, I'll give you an email at the end and you can ask me and I'll send it to you. This person claims that children from poverty have different experiences. They have a greater need for love. Does that mean if I'm poor, I don't have love? You know, in our house, we could tell you the color of the cheese box, you know, welfare cheese, or what powdered milk tasted like, but we had tremendous love and we were safe. You know, I don't think I speak louder than other students, although it depends who's in the room with me and if they're my friends, right? It says we're more sensitive and we need more specific guidance. These are really important voices speaking about the education of our children, our bilingual children, and really already putting them in a box linguistically that is already shutting them off and turning some piece of equity away and creating belief systems that perpetuate this systemic lack of or systemic oppression in education, right? Because we use language to name. That's it. And favor a group in power. We give language that says you can because you're a judge or a teacher or a doctor. And leadership in language, you know, shifts. When you're at home and it's social language, there's still power in that language and in the community. We just don't often recognize it. There's nonverbal power, right? Who decides the content in school? Who paces our calendar? Who sets these conditions for learning and grades and promotes the flow of communication? Who makes the most important decision for our students? And do we teach our students the power of language to either push them towards a place of liberation or to hold them back? There are lots of implications of power through language. Classroom, the teacher is always powerful, right? But how do we use our power to hand over some power to our students? How do we communicate that to them through our instruction and behavior? And how do we communicate to them that standardized assessments are an extremely powerful tool of language that act as a filter, not to see how far you've come, although we could, if that's the only way we used it, but we also use it as a filter, because at some point those standardized assessments become a block, right? Getting into college, passing teacher exams, passing medical exams, they become a block, a filter. We're going to go to the breakout room, and it's not going to be for very long. Laura's going to send you there. And when you're there, I want you to just talk in your small group about an example of language that you heard as a student that gave you some sort of power, and you felt like you were learning. Your learning was empowered. And an example of language that reduced your power to learn. Please go to your breakout rooms. Laura will send you there. You'll be there for 2 minutes.
Okay, everybody ready? We go to the breakout rooms.
Gracias, Laura.
Let me assign you to any breakout rooms.
Sí, parece que necesitamos más.
Okay. Estás en mute, Alma. Digo, Mari.
Ah, sí, aquí estoy.
Okay.
Déjame ponerlo otra vez de share porque, ahí está.
Ok, Mari, ahorita ya son las 4:30, nada más para que vayas teniendo conciencia.
Vamos, cierra los breakout rooms, aunque fue menos que 2 minutos.
Les faltan 30 segundos, ya están de regreso casi.
Ok, qué bueno.
Nada más para que midas tu tiempo ahorita, ¿ok?
Ok,
De
gracias.
todos modos, te voy a dar la campanita ahorita, faltando 5, ¿ok?
Sí, gracias. Gracias. A ver si no me pongo tan animada para hablar más rápido.
Sí, uno se emociona cuando está aquí haciendo presentación.
¿Verdad?
Ok, ya vienen ahora sí de regreso.
Ok, gracias. Muy amable. Creo que quizás, Laura, para el próximo breakout, en vez de hacer breakout, nada más que voy a decirles que piensen en la pregunta para que nos acabe el tiempo.
Perfecto.
Okay, so welcome back, everyone, from the breakout room where you thought about how language empowered you or took away your power when you were trying to learn, right? That moment when a teacher said, I'm not here to help you people. Or, oh, you don't write very well. Or, what do you mean? I can't understand what you're saying. Or did they say things like, you're trying, you're doing great. This is where you could go next. So I'm going to just move past the one share for a moment. And I'm going to ask, what happens when we share rather than build? Linguistic racism is very prevalent today in education, everywhere. Low expectations for lots of our bilingual children who are standard English learners. It's manifest through correctionism. No, this is wrong, say it like this, do it like that, right? In particular for the 5 million language learners who either read below a basic level or who are trying to get through the primary grades, and even more now with this whole COVID thing and the sort of that interrupted schooling, right? We now have millions of children that have interrupted formal education because staring at little squares all day is not quite the same as being in a classroom. And this situation of not learning and this linguistic racism, it's the same. It's the same it was when I was 6 years old. And that was many more years than 20. But we have got to change that pedagogically. We have got to change it. So who can counter this? It has to be us. It has to be leaders and teachers who counteract these negative effects. That doesn't mean we always say it right or do it right or communicate it right, but it means we're very reflective. And the way we know is we ask them. We ask them. And there's something really important about what has happened that has been destructive to native languages or that has been very oppressive to our students or communicated to them in some form. You are less than. Healing does not mean that the damage doesn't exist. It means that it does not control you. So as you empower them with language, they are no longer controlled by a power that sort of holds them down. They can use language to lift and move themselves and others. Language and power at school are really important. Different social groups have different discourse, right? Being from an inner city school, that's how my school was described. Someone came in once and said, oh, I'd never know that I was in Roxbury because, oh, listen to these students talk. Well, what did you think? What did you think my students were going to sound like, right? People have these expectations about these discourse patterns that presumes that someone knows less than or cannot think or process, right? That leads us to say, oh, these children are prepared for school. These children are not so prepared. And I'm really worried that when we talk about now learning loss and COVID and all the things that have happened, we're going to start to use these labels again and more frequently. Who's better prepared? Instead of what are they bringing? Where are their strengths and their funds of knowledge? Where is their cultural capital? And how can I do the work linguistically of taking them from there to the next place that they need to be? You know, we often push academic language for math, for health, for English language arts, Spanish language arts. We could talk about that picture that you see there in every single one of those content areas. But if we did it with academic language, we'd be like, whoa, you're smart. Instead of saying, those are so cool, I'm gonna get me some. Should I be talking about the angle, the proportion, the health values, and using academic words? I could, but I must give value to those non-academic patterns of speech as well, because they are just as powerful. And the key here is to help students be able to interpret and infer when to use which. One of the things we have to monitor ourselves for as we wrap up to the last 5 minutes here together is, do we use euphemisms? Do we find nice ways to say things so that they sound good? And really, again, it's this power sneaking in there to say, oh, we're going to keep the status quo. Non-standard English speakers, what is that? Immediately the value goes to English, right? Or limited English proficient, or English learners, bilingual students. What is it that we're really saying? What is our mission? What happens when they leave our programs, right? What happens when they leave dual language or bilingual or English as a second language or new language in different states they call it, or TESOL? How do we continue to support them and make sure that these labels that limit them are removed? Find a new way to call them that empowers them and that empowers the conversation you have with your colleagues. In medicine, for example, they try really hard to use language that's empowering. But we know that even in medicine, they use words and language especially when the physical space empowers them to be above us, that sort of keep us a little bit below. How do we look at that in medicine and then bring it into a classroom? How does this space provide power for my students who I teach at the university? Or your space if you're in a classroom. Classroom language cannot be dominated by the teacher, not always determined, and not always heavily regulated, right? When does it become aspirational? How do we make it aspirational and powerful for our students? I think we name it. I think that's what we do. We teach them the power and regulation and control in a classroom is this, and this is how and when you use it. And then there's other language that's just as powerful, that's also regulated, and that's to be respected, that you bring with you and you can use in other settings for a purpose. I think we tell them that. And we monitor ourselves and we monitor them and we monitor our colleagues so that they're affected by what we do for our strategies for learning, the status of language, personal attitudes, and motivations. We have to find ways to motivate the students, promote the relevance of language instruction, and expand opportunities for diverse language, formal, informal, all forms in our classrooms, even though there are disagreements that we know that come all the time about that, right? Si habla en español con la Z o sin la Z. I studied in Puerto Rico and I studied in Spain. In one place they thought I spoke Spanish and the other place they thought I didn't. I'll let you figure that out based on what you think might have happened. But there are some key themes, and I'm just going to point out the red. Think about our students, their parents, their families, and the community, how we connect and interact with all of these people, and how do we celebrate the language that our students are using while pushing them forward with the academic language that's necessary without intimidating, judging, or coercing them, because we have the power to do that by just our selection of words. This is a call to action for all of us, all 140 some odd of us that are in this space, to really comprehend and address these behaviors in ourselves, those euphemisms, the way we use language to control, right? Are we passive aggressive? Do we use these microaggressions without even knowing? I don't think we come to school saying, oh, today I'm going to use this word because it's going to just knock them off their feet. No, but we monitor and we reflect and we keep trying to learn, because this is our moment. This is our moment to share solidarity with the students that we teach.
Thank you so much, Dr. Campanario. So we are closing right now. Yep. Thank you, everybody, for your patience. And we are going to put it some link in the chat so you can answer a questionnaire. So we just want to thank you, Dr. Campanario. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy your sessions. We need to move to the next one. So have a nice evening, Dr. Campanario.
Gracias, gracias. I want to thank all of you. I want to tell you how much I love that there's actually things called bilingual conferences, because when a kid that used to get put in the corner for not being able to say something because they didn't speak English sees that there are over 100 people times however many rooms are going on right now that are advocating for kids just like that. It's very hard not to become emotional. So miles y miles y miles gracias. You are more appreciated than any of you can imagine. And don't stop. Don't stop. No matter how hard it gets, don't stop.
Thank you so much. Enjoy your sessions.
Muchas gracias. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.